Okay, welcome everyone to the RC workshop on the political economy of Brexit. So today we're very happy to have the keynote speakers that you're going to see soon. And this is going to be the order that they're going to be presenting. If you want to see the final version, you can go to our website here, click, and then you can see the topics and the keynote speakers and follow through. So let me just first introduce who I am too. My name is Marcelo Chauvet, and I'm the director of the RCEA, the Rimini Centre of Economic Analysis, which now has the headquarters here in the US. Claudio Morana is the director of RCEA in Europe. And the RCEA has now 14 research groups, as you can see here, and you can also see that in our web page. And these research groups are organized several activities, including webinars, conferences, workshops, and research groups. And each one of them, some of them are more active already than others, but each one of them is going to be organizing at least one conference a year, big conferences a year. So if you would like to join, like to have more information about it, send an email to us, rcaworld@gmail.com, and also visit our webpage at rca.world. So there you can also see our scientific committee, our new fellows, and several other activities of RCEA, including classes. We have online classes before on econometrics and macroeconometrics. We're going to have one on big data. So we'll just follow up with us. So welcome again. And I'll now pass the word to Michael Plummer, who is one of the board, the executive member of the board of directors of RCEA. So thank you, Michael. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass the word to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Marcel, and good afternoon, everyone. As Marcel mentioned, my name is Mike Plummer, and I'm director of Johns Hopkins University, SAIS Europe in Bologna, as well as a member of the board of RCEA. And I feel very fortunate to be chairing this panel with such exceptional scholars and on such a critical topic, the political economy of Brexit. In discussions with our colleagues at RCEA, in addition to Marcel and Claudio, also Gigi Palloni, we agreed that the center certainly needed to do something on Brexit 5 years after the famous, or in the view of many of us, infamous Brexit vote, but that we needed to take an interdisciplinary approach, as the implications of Brexit certainly go beyond the confines of mere economics. Hence, this panel has been organized jointly between the International Trade Study Group and the political economy research groups of RCEA. And we're delighted that such an influential group of scholars has agreed to take part in this panel, which in and of itself testifies to its importance. Given that the issues raised related to the topic are well known to everyone, and we've been debating them for the past 5 years, I could dispense with offering an overview of the subject and proceed directly with the panel. Indeed, time will be a binding constraint as we have 6 presentations, and hence we have to move on quickly. Each panelist will be given 20 to 25 minutes for their presentation. And panelists, please forgive me if I have to be a bit rigid, a timekeeper. Trust me, this is a real problem in Italy, and we've learned to be actually quite draconian. This will give us enough time for 30 minutes of discussion at the end of the panel. And given the variety and the scope of the content, we certainly will have a lot to discuss. So let's start it off. And to kick us off, we have Tony Venables of Oxford University and Manchester University, as well as chair of the Department of International Trade's Trade Policy Expert Panel. And Tony will talk to us about regional impacts. So, Professor Venables.
Great, thank you, Michael. And let me obviously thank the organisers for putting this session together. Should be an interesting afternoon, I think. Let me endeavour to share screen. Is that successful?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Okay, what I want to do is a fairly sort of straightforward run through the 5 points, the five bullets that I've put there. First, rather briefly, the UK regional problem. It'll be known to many of the people on the call, but I'm assuming not all, so I'll say a few words about that. Then the referendum, and obviously the geographical aspects of it, the regional aspects, I should have said what my title is, The Political Economy of Brexit, Regional Issues. So I'm coming at it from that angle. Then very briefly, obviously the following political implications through the general election. And then regional outcomes, where obviously it's too soon to know that much, but we do know something. So point 4, there's going to be regional outcomes, gainers and losers, insofar as we know so far. And then if time permitting, a very little bit of speculation about future regional outcomes. So I'm an economist, I'm going to come at it from a pretty economistic standpoint, but you'll have to bear with that. And I'm failing to scroll down. That's interesting. That's better. Okay, is that okay? Good, right. Yeah, so point 1, the UK regional problem. I guess you all know the basic descriptives, but very briefly, you know, a couple of maps there. Employment rates varying across the countries, and wages and other measures of incomes varying as well. So what you're seeing, the dark shading, is obviously London, the southeast, the high wage areas, and then much lower income areas. Some in the periphery, Cornwall, Wales, the north, some the West Midlands, that east coast, Lincolnshire and up, areas of relatively low income. Not leaping out of those maps, but an important fact is that large cities in the UK do badly, or at least badly, well, obviously with the exception of London, other large cities do badly, or relative to the expectation of productivity in large cities. Virtually all the UK cities, apart from London, are below the national average. So particularly the large northern cities performing badly. History, I think the history of it is actually pretty straightforward. The deindustrialization shocks of the 1970s and 80s hit the traditional heartland manufacturing areas. Okay, Cornwall and Wales might be a bit different, but the essence of the story are those shocks of the 70s and 80s. And that followed by some selective outmigration. I shouldn't have put outmigration of workers on the slide. I should have put outmigration of graduates, actually, you know, young people going to university and not returning, or some of the most able not returning to the regions. And probably more important than that, the adjustment mechanism of firms moving into these low wage places really didn't work very well. So periods of unemployment, not unemployment anymore, but the firms that did move, the sectors that are mobile are largely low skill activities. So it's, you know, the call centers and warehousing and backroom stuff. Whereas obviously the higher value activities, the sticky sectors, the high-tech sectors that are difficult to move, did not move into those regions. And then, of course, you know, following from that, all the cumulative causation things we expect, public finance, education, skills, youth aspiration, all cut in. Let me give you sort of one other fact on that. I think it's quite important. If you go back to 1970, or rather, no, let's start now. 2/3 of the most deprived local authority districts in the UK are districts that in the early 1970s were sort of average, and they took a hit in the 1970s, not actually in the 80s, and really early on in the 1970s. So 2/3 of the most deprived regions, or local authority districts, quite small areas, as I say, were average at the beginning of the 70s, but, you know, prosperous manufacturing took a hit at that time. And basically 40 or 50 years later, they haven't recovered. Those places are constituting 2/3 of what are now the most deprived regions. So an astonishing degree of persistence, which is interesting in itself, but not the subject of this talk. A couple of other quick sort of background things on the regional problem. One statistical thing that I think is worth saying: the economic differentials, as reported, are often exaggerated. The box and whisker plots there give different measures of these regional variations across the UK. People often report some GDP per capita or GVA per capita, which is a mad thing to report because it's GVA in a region created by employees divided by the number of residents. So obviously it's very low in a place full of pensioners and exceptionally high in a place that people commute into. But you get that sort of crazy 4-to-1 dispersion if you look at that, and that is often reported. If you go to GVA per hour, it goes down. If you go to wages, it goes down. If it goes to earnings, it's quite low. If you start adjusting, if you start looking at disposable income or disposable income net of housing costs, which is the extreme right-hand one there, the numbers are less. And that's not the only factor distorting things. I mean, the units of measurement distort things as well. So on some measures, the UK is the most regionally unequal country in the high-income country. In other measures, it's a bit worse than average. So you shouldn't exaggerate that. But if I say the economic differentials are exaggerated, obviously there are disparities. And the income measures are correlated with many, many other social indicators, deprivation measures. I could go through a long list. The scatter plot there is wages against proportion of the working population with degrees. And it's astonishing thing about that diagram is not so much the correlation as the range on the horizontal axis, from 20% to over 50%, well over 50%. So there are the disparities. Okay, let me go on to the vote. So was it regional? What did regions have to do with it? Well, the top scatter plot there gives you the basic story. Okay, the dots are local authority districts again. A wage measure on the horizontal axis and a pretty clear regression line. Less clear if you remove the obvious outliers like the City of London, but still low income places voted leave. It's the stylized fact coming out of that. There's very good work by Sasha Becker and co-authors, really going into the detail of that, looking at the vote against various characteristics. So the two maps there, the reddish one is the Brexit vote share, and you can immediately see London is white, voted to remain, and then the regional pattern. And for comparison, I've put next to it the no qualification share of the labour force, and clearly pretty high correspondence between the two, with the exception, of course, that was a Remainer. The paper by Becker and his co-authors digs deeper into that, looking at what the regional characteristics were that drove the vote share in the Leave vote in each of these areas. I think it's worth reading. We find that factors such as exposure to immigration, trade vulnerability provide little explanatory power. Instead, it's characteristics of the voting population. So that great list of social characteristics that I didn't read out a moment ago, education profiles, historical dependence on manufacturing, income levels, unemployment levels, those were the drivers. So they're showing up regionally because those are factors in the regions and they're factors in the vote. Surprise. Okay, so the vote, had that strong geographical and regional element, as we know. And of course, that followed through. I'm not going to trace the politics of that. Other people on this call are much better able than I am to do that. but it followed through into the elections. So the scatter plot on the left here is the swing, the Conservative Labour swing in the 2017 election in particular, with the Leave share on the horizontal axis. So yes, places that voted Leave had the big swing to the Tories in the following election. Obviously, lasting political consequences coming through to the shape of the present government. How am I doing for time? Going quite fast, I suspect.
You've got about 10 minutes.
Okay. Let me talk about outcomes a little bit then. Okay, so regional pattern, or the characteristics of the people in the regions driving the vote. What do we know about outcomes? On this slide, I want to talk briefly about two sorts of studies. One I'm calling not quite accurately ex-ante prediction, since it was the study was done after the vote. But it was really using ex-ante methods. So it was saying, well, what do we know, or rather, what do we think will happen to trade barriers, tariffs, and things upon exit? And then using trade and equilibrium modeling techniques to map through impacts for the UK as a whole, but also impacts, region by region. And that exercise, that economic modeling exercise, predicted that the effect of Brexit would be to increase UK regional inequalities. The mechanism was essentially trade barriers, hitting manufacturing, although one would say also potentially hitting financial services. But anyway, just reporting the study, the predicted trade barriers essentially hitting the vote leave regions harder than other places. So regional inequalities being increased, and those who voted for leave being in places that were going to suffer the most. The ex post evaluation data going up to 2019. Once again, Timo Fetzer, one of the authors on the earlier paper I was talking about, a very, very careful, very interesting, detailed study of what happened up to 2019. Now, what they do it at the level of different regional levels, both the large regions, but then right down to local authority districts, and construct synthetic controls for those places. That is to say, what would have happened to income in those places if they continued to behave the same way as they had before relative to a control group? And they're using very sophisticated measures to construct the control group from subnational data all around Europe and North America. So, which regions, which combination of regions in these other countries, best tracked a particular region in the UK. They're using some artificial intelligence techniques to sort that out. Then using that synthetic control group, the doppelganger, to predict what might have happened absent Brexit, region by region, or district by district in the UK, and mapping through the results. Okay, what do they find? The central, the red and blue map there, red are the losers to 2019, using the losers relative to the synthetic controls. Red are the losers, blue are the gainers, and grey are statistically not going either way. I'm showing the map, but it doesn't make it quite as vivid as the statistical analysis does. Partly because a lot of the blue areas are very, very small, so they don't come over on the map. So let me give you some numbers. There are 168 red areas on that map and 78 blue ones, 78 gainers. If you look at the big regions, not the fine level there, but the big regions, well, first look at the country as a whole. they predict the data is revealing about a 2.5% loss of income just to 2019, right? Just that far. That's about £50 billion a year loss for the nation as a whole. Looking at big regions, in the southeast, it's about 3.1% of GDP, but Northern Ireland, it's 4.7%, the East Midlands, 5.3%. So you are getting that regional pattern of the deprived places, the places that voted leave, being the losers. Quite strong regional differentiation in that. So to summarize the main messages, well, I think when they look at this and look at the correlates of being a loser rather than being a winner, the correlates are having voted leave. That's the scatter plot on the left, right? So it's on the horizontal axis there. It's the share of the leave vote in the referendum. And well, you see the slope. Vote leave, lose more. The other main correlates they talk to are places with low qualifications, are the losers, and places with relatively high share manufacturing activity are the losers. So that's actually remarkably consistent with the ex-ante stuff, but is generated by real data, or at least by a comparison of real data with the synthetic controls. But it's a very careful study indeed, and using powerful techniques to get hold of the synthetic controls. So that's what we know about the regional impact so far. If I've got sort of 1 minute left, let me just kind of speculate idly and then hand over to others. Okay, at the moment, obviously, it's all about, the UK is very much about some of the labour market implications of Brexit and labour shortages, which I'm sure are making headlines around the world. Now, Jonathan's infinitely better qualified to speak about this than I am, but let me nevertheless make a few remarks. There is a likelihood of wage and price increases in the UK for multiple reasons, as there are around other countries. But one of those reasons being labour shortages following the end of free movement. I guess we believe that's going to lead to some wage increases, some price increases, maybe mitigated by a supply response, maybe not. Now, the government's line on this at the moment is that the supply response will be turning us into a high wage, high skill economy. Fantastic. But if you think about it for a moment, what might the supply response be? Well, if you're short of labour in a tradable sector, it's going to be imports, not domestic production that responds. It might be productivity in a few sectors, raising investment, but that doesn't come free, and it's certainly not going to be in all sectors. But ultimately, if you think about it for a moment, well, the third mechanism rather is reallocation of UK labour to those sectors. But if you think about that for a moment, these are on the whole relatively low skill sectors, hospitality, agriculture, things like that. So Johnson's high wage, high skill economy is let's reallocate some labour to low skill sectors, albeit maybe paying them a higher wage than they would might have got before. But it's a very strange. Anyway, Jonathan will no doubt say a good deal more in a more informed way. Finally, on the regional level, regional side, levelling up. Now, there will be a government white paper on this in the next month or so. So I don't know what we're going to do about levelling up. There's an awful lot of words about it, but nothing very specific from the government. I mean, my personal view, I suppose, is that there certainly is scope for policy probably concentrating on some of those lagging cities I was talking about earlier to bring, in inverted commas or not, transformational change, really try and get some of those cities working. I suspect the levelling up policy won't really do that. It'll smear some money around some of the smaller towns, some of the suffering places, probably achieving rather little. But there, we don't even have the policy yet, much less the outcomes on which I should be possibly making those statements. But let me stop at that point. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Tony, and thanks for setting a great example and being punctual in your remarks and actually offering a great deal of food for thought. Okay, our next presenter is Jonathan Portes from King's College, who'll talk to us about the political economy of immigration and free movement. Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and that was a very good kickoff from Tony, which, as he says, I will try and follow up on some of the points made. But first, a bit of statistical background. So this chart shows migration to the migration to the UK, divided between citizens of the EU and people from outside the EU in the last decade. This pattern is very interesting, and of course explains quite a lot, both about in itself tells you quite a lot both about the causes and the consequences of Brexit, because you can see from that yellow line the very sharp rise in migration from the EU, particularly citizens of Bulgaria and Romania after the 2014 relaxation of labour market controls. And just before the referendum, indeed, migration from the EU peaked at over 200,000 a year. This compared, of course, to the government's then target of a maximum of 100,000 net migration from all sources. Meanwhile, at the same time, the migration from outside the EU had fallen quite significantly, particularly over the 2010 to 2012 period. And it's worth saying what happened here, right? So the government, David Cameron, in a successful, made a politically successful pledge in the short term, but politically deeply damaging pledge in the long term in the run-up to the 2010 election, which was to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands, that is to under 100,000. Now, some of his civil servants told him shortly after he took office, I know because it was me, told him that achieving this would require either a major recession, the UK to leave the European Union, or to the UK to deliberately inflict significant economic damage on itself, and that therefore this was not a particularly clever thing to pledge. Nevertheless, he ignored me. One of the reasons I didn't last very long under the new regime. But of course, reality did not listen to the Prime Minister. And so the government found itself in this position, strange position of trying to reduce net migration with only a limited number of levers, given the existence of free movement. What did that mean? It meant in particular that the government had to impose quite tight restrictions on the levers it did control, notably skilled workers from outside the EU and international students. Unfortunately, of course, these are the categories of migration where almost everybody agrees there is a significant net economic gain to the country for obvious reasons. So this was a policy which was both economically damaging, but also didn't achieve the objective because migration from the EU rose at the same time, offsetting any of the effects of this reduction. The consequence, of course, as we know politically, was first the Brexit referendum and then the Brexit vote. I'll say a bit more about that in a little while. But what happened after that is that there was then a significant fall off in EU migration for a variety of reasons: the fall in the pound, perhaps a general psychological perception among migrants that the UK was no longer a welcoming place for Europeans, and so on. But again, this actually didn't necessarily lead to a huge reduction in migration overall, because this, what we in migration call the balloon effect, the fact that if you push down migration in one part of the labour market from one source, it often tends to pop up in another. Migration from the EU from outside the EU rose again correspondingly after that, as, for example, health, became harder to recruit people for the health service from the EU. The government then relaxed some of the constraints that it had imposed on health workers from the outside the EU, and migration rose again. That chart in itself tells you quite a bit about what's happened about the past decade, but it's also working on, this is a chart that looks at what that in turn did to the overall population. And I think this is sort of the big picture, although not quite the whole picture, as I'll say in a minute, because you can see that over the period from 2004 to just before the pandemic, the number of EU nationals resident in the UK, according to the Office of National Statistics, rose from about 1.5 million to something a lot closer to about 3.4 million. So a rise of about 2 million, more than a doubling. Quite a big change, you might think, in the UK population. But recent months have led us to think again about that, because we have new data. And it turns out that actually even that dramatic picture is likely to be a considerable underestimate. What we see here is the number of, under the withdrawal agreement, the UK is obliged to offer permanent residence to all EU nationals resident here, who have been living, who are exercising their free movement rights at or before the time of Brexit. And it turns out that so far, we have not got 3.4 million applications from the 3.4 million EU citizens who the ONS thought were resident in the UK in about 2019, 2020. We actually have pushing 6 million applications. Now, while some of those are duplicates and some, as the bottom bar of this chart shows here, are actually from non-EEA nationals, they're partners and family members of EU nationals also exercising derived rights under the free movement rules. We're nonetheless talking about a number well in excess of 5 million EU nationals who already have been given the right to permanent residence in the UK as a consequence of the withdrawal agreement. So this is really, this is just a very big number, and a surprisingly big number, a number that has surprised even people like me, who had been saying for some years that the immigration figures and the population figures were messed up in various ways. I think we have been quite surprised to see that, for example, although the ONS claims, the ONS official figures show that there were 400,000 Romanians living in the UK in 2019, we have in the region of 1 million applications from Romanian nationals for permanent residence in the UK. And perhaps I'm not going to say more about it now because it's a huge subject, but that will have some pretty profound effects on UK economy, politics, and society over the next 10 or 20 years. It takes a long time for these things to work through, as we know from the experience of previous large migration waves. So what about the political economy of Brexit? As Tony said, research by Tinio Fetzer and others, and sort of actual just straight observational descriptive stats tell you that at a local level, it wasn't immigration that caused Brexit. That is to say, if anything, there's a negative correlation between places that have loads of immigrants, like London, and places that voted for Brexit. You don't see that correlation at a local level. You don't really see it that much, even at an individual level, for people who you might think of as being disadvantaged by migration were more likely to vote for Brexit. That might be true for people with low qualifications, but actually the biggest source of the Brexit vote was people who are retired, who clearly aren't threatened by migrants taking their jobs since they don't have any. In fact, you'd think they'd be more in favor of immigration because migrants can pay their pensions, but no. But nonetheless, I think it's unarguable, and there's loads of sort of attitudinal polling evidence to confirm that immigration and free movement were key political drivers of the Brexit vote. It was certainly the substantive issue. If you ask people why did they vote Brexit, they voted Brexit to take control of immigration. That at least is the most important reason that people tend to give. So you have that sort of contradiction. That's certainly why people voted, but it doesn't necessarily correlate with the reality of what they experienced. But perhaps more importantly, free movement was also therefore a key driver of the form of Brexit. So we have had, as everybody here listening knows, a 4 years of soap opera between the political soap opera in the UK and to some extent in Brussels between the referendum and today about what form of Brexit. Was it going to be a soft Brexit? Was it going to be a customs union? What does regulatory alignment mean? All of that stuff, complete with dramas in Parliament, knife-edge votes, ministers resigning, Prime Minister being Theresa May having to resign. All of this soap opera, which makes it all seem very complicated and difficult to understand. But in some sense, actually, it's not really that hard, right? Ultimately, the UK faced a choice between, after voting for Brexit, were we going to stay in the single market or not? Were we going to, that essentially came down to a choice, were we going to keep free movement or not? And ultimately, given the political driver, that the importance of free movement as a driver of the vote, and given the Prime Minister's commitment as early as October 2016 to the Conservative Party conference that free movement would end, no ifs, no buts, in that sense, the choice was always binary, and that choice was made in the first 2 or 3 months after the referendum. In other words, the form of Brexit we have now was fundamentally determined by the nature of the vote and that initial decision to, quote, respect, unquote, the nature of that vote as regards free movement. And everything else, it seems to me, is primarily noise. In other words, we probably were always going to end up where we have ended up. It was free movement that took us out of the single market. And it is also, I think, therefore, the case that not only is immigration and free movement the key political driver of the Brexit vote, the new post-Brexit migration system is by far the largest discretionary economic and regulatory change that resulted from Brexit so far. This is one area where we have taken back control. We have our own new migration system. We, apart from that, what else have we done? Blue passports and restoring pounds and furlongs or something. But in terms of actual substantive policy change that results from Brexit, the new migration system is where the action has been so far. What can we say about that system? A lot of talk during the referendum about an Australian points-based system, and the government still uses that phrase sometimes. It's not Australian, and it's only nominally points-based. The key point is that we have essentially taken the old system for non-EEA nationals, the so-called Tier 2 skilled visa system, and extended it to EU nationals. That's key point one. But the second key point is that we have considerably liberalized it. In other words, we have not leveled down or leveled up, as it would, depending which way you look at it, as Theresa May wanted. Theresa May wanted us to impose the same restrictive system that we imposed on non-Europeans on Europeans. We've actually met in the middle. So the new system essentially says that you can come to the UK to do a job if you have a job offer at a salary of about £25,000 and with at a skill level above something called RQF3, which essentially corresponds to graduating high school. And the key point is this is pretty low by international standards. By my calculations, not official, but I've checked them with people in government, and I know they're basically right. That means that 50% of jobs in the UK are now open to foreign nationals. That is to say, half of all jobs, it's not just high-skilled jobs or even upper middle skilled jobs that are eligible for a work visa. It's half of all jobs. And there are there's also some special provisions for PhDs, new entrants, NHS education. So overall, this is, by my reckoning, functionally a much more liberal and less restrictive system towards non-Europeans than almost any major EU country currently operates. So the new system is not just about restrictionism resulting from the ending of free movement. It is obviously considerably more restrictive for Europeans by definition. It's also considerably more liberal for non-Europeans. And there have been some other things that we no longer have a resident labor market test. You do not have to prove that the job you're offering to a foreigner can't be done by somebody already resident in this country. There is no quota or cap. And at the same time, not part of the system, we've also taken what could potentially, probably won't be, but potentially, and not non-zero probability, by far the most radical immigration policy decision of any UK government, certainly since 2004, which is to offer the possibility of to offer visas leading to permanent settlement for up to 5.2 million people currently resident in Hong Kong. That's a lot of people. Now, the likelihood is that most of them won't come, but that is not under our control. If, it could well be that things get much better in Hong Kong and only a few thousand come. It could equally well be the fact that things get a lot worse in Hong Kong and many, many hundreds of thousands at least come. And that is something that is no longer under the UK government's control. It's really down to the Chinese government, which is an interesting position to. So we have taken back control, but we've chosen to exercise that control in a way which potentially has some very, very interesting consequences for the future shape of UK immigration. But what's the idea of this new system then? This system, which, as I said, is not necessarily as restrictionist as many of us have feared. It is more restrictionist in some ways, and we're seeing the effects of that now. So here we have what the system may or may not achieve. The rationale for the system is the first 4 bullet points, right? This is, and I wrote this some months ago, but this is essentially what Boris Johnson and Kwasi Kwarteng have been saying in their speeches for the past few days as a rationale of the new system. By stopping free movement, we're going to boost wages for Brits. We're going to force employers to train up and develop our own. Moreover, without being able to rely on cheap labor, employers will have to invest, they'll have to improve productivity. And at the same time, we can recruit the best and brightest people, the ones we really want, from anywhere in the world. On the other hand, of course, the downsides, potential downsides, also very prominent in the press in the last few days, are staff shortages, business failures in some cases, particularly in some parts of the agricultural sector, higher prices for everybody as the lack of labor pushes up costs, and potentially damage to key public services, where at the moment in particular the social care sector is frankly imploding, not just because of Brexit and new migration controls by any means, but it's certainly one of the major aggravating factors. So how do I think that will play out? Well, I as I've said publicly a couple of times in the last few days, I think the idea that restricting migration any more than restricting trade is the way that a country transitions to a high skill, high productivity, high wage economy is not one that most economists would take remotely seriously. The idea that stopping British employers recruit people is going to do much to improve productivity is, I think, very unlikely. Most of the research, some of which I've done in the UK context, suggests that migration is probably broadly positive for productivity, not negative. It could boost, restricting migration could, of course, increase wages in some sectors, but if it doesn't increase productivity, it will just reduce wages in other sectors, because costs and hence prices will go up. So broadly, in my view, restricting migration through ending free movement is mostly a fairly inefficient way of making us slightly poorer and redistributing income. On the other hand, I do think it is fair, as I've said in the previous slide, that some of the liberalization with respect to migration from the rest of the world may have some positive impacts. And if indeed hundreds of thousands of people do arrive from Hong Kong, then slightly randomly and not for economic reasons, we might find ourselves with a major, a big economic boost. Not something we should necessarily hope for, given what the implications of that would be, but it certainly would be good for the UK economy. On the other hand, I do think some of the catastrophizing about the UK economy coming to a complete stop without migrant workers or without free movement is overdone. What is happening now is partly Brexit and migration, but mostly COVID, as seen by the fact that the US is also experiencing a lot of staff shortages, the fact that price pressures are pretty pervasive throughout the developed world. So some of it is Brexit and migration in particular, but not all of it by any means. And most of this is likely to be short-term adjustment. The economy will adjust. As I said, it may make us slightly poorer, but we're not going to be, we won't be starving because we can no longer slaughter our own pigs. If, one way or another, the economy will adjust. And that's pretty much what the sort of long-run quantitative estimates of the impact of the migration changes say. Of course, this reduction, there will be a reduction in EU migration, probably but some offsetting increase in non-EU migration. The impact on GDP will be negative, but the impact on GDP per capita will probably be relatively small and uncertain. I think that is the best guess we have at the moment. I thought it was worth just putting in one really, really up-to-date slide just to counter some of the excessive hysteria about this one on both sides in the press. This shows real wages in the UK, both overall and for accommodation and food services, which of course is a sector where there are a lot of European migrants working. And while it does show a very sharp bounce back after the pandemic, as you'd expect, this doesn't really show, to my mind, any sort of wage explosion as yet. We are not, the idea that somehow wages are rocketing in the most effective sectors, I think is an exaggeration. And indeed, in the last few months, overall wages have been pretty much flat because rising nominal wages have been cancelled out by rising prices. So finally, just to conclude, this really is a reset moment for British immigration policy. These are really very, very radical changes indeed, both in terms of the policy and in terms of what's actually happening on the ground. The key questions here, I think, are what are the medium-term impacts of COVID and Brexit on the UK labour market and hence on migration? How does public opinion evolve? Public opinion's actually been remarkably positive about migration in the UK over the last few years. Public attitudes have really shifted in a positive direction for reasons we don't fully understand, which gives the government a bit more policy space. What is the interaction between this policy and broader economic policy, levelling up and so on, some of the questions raised in Tony's presentation, and a sort of broader one about whether, do we want to be global Britain or little England? And ministerial rhetoric on this, as with policy, has pointed in both directions at the same time. Because it is quite bizarre that at the same time we're saying that we are potentially opening our doors to millions of people from Hong Kong, and yet at the same time that the central plank of the government strategy to make us a high productivity economy is essentially autarky in terms of people. Those two things do not sit very well together, and of course, one of Johnson and his administration's great talent so far has been to reconcile these contradictions without being too worried about the fact that there are inconsistencies. But there's some interesting questions about whether you can carry on with that forever. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan. Again, thanks for keeping to time. Move on to Professor Mary Calder, who's a professor at the London School of Economics, who will talk about Brexit and democracy. Mary.
You're mute.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. And so far it's been really fascinating. And what I'm going to say, I think, tunes in quite well with what's been said. Many of us who were involved, I was very involved in the anti-Brexit campaign. And we now feel a huge sense of disempowerment and frustration that what we did failed so abysmally. I mean, we ended up with what none of us wanted. And we are seeing all the consequences that we talked about during the campaign, shortages, tension in Northern Ireland, the likely independence of Scotland, I could go on, which were dismissed at the time as Project Fear. So what I thought I would do, I would start with a research project which we undertook at LSE, in which we looked at 5 local areas, 2 remain, 1 marginal and 2 leave. We sent PhD students out to research them and to look at why people voted and the likely impact of Brexit. And what we really wanted to do during the Brexit campaign, one of the things that was so utterly depressing was this huge rejection of expertise. This idea that experts don't matter, we shouldn't take seriously what experts say. And so we wanted actually to look at what was under the kind of statistical picture that Tony has given us and try to see what those figures meant in terms of people's experience in those areas. And I'd just like to talk about 2 leave areas. I won't talk about the others. And these 2 leave areas were Pendle in the northwest. Pendle is still a manufacturing area. It's home to Rolls-Royce Aerospace. It's also an agricultural area. And the other area was Mansfield in the Midlands, which was a former mining and textile areas. And they're both very typical of the declining industrial areas that were described by Tony. In neither case was immigration very high. In Pendle, there's a South Asian community that came to work in the textile mills during the 1960s and 1970s. And in Mansfield, there's a recent East European community, mostly Polish, people who came to do low-paid, zero-contract jobs in retail, namely in Sports Direct, an online sports firm that has made its headquarters in Mansfield. And what we did was we presented our results in both these places to a cross-section of people and got their reaction. And what was overwhelming to me in listening to this discussion was the sense of disempowerment. That was really what was behind it. And indeed, many people actually said that they thought immigration was a proxy or red herring for other concerns that people had. And those concerns were about the lack of skills, lack of skill training, very poor infrastructure, lack of investment, and the general sense of neglect. A very nice example in view of I don't know if people have been following British newspapers, but farmers are beginning to kill their pigs because of a lack of butchers. That was brought up in Pendle. The abattoir there only had East European butchers because there was no skill training for British butchers. But what was actually above all their concern when they presented these concerns was the feeling that nobody was listening. That they had Labour MPs, in the case of Mansfield, they went Conservative in 2017, they had Labour MPs who took them for granted. Nobody was interested in what they had to say. And actually, even more interesting, they all started talking about new political structures. In Pendle, they said, what we really need is a Northwest Parliament, a parliament for the Northwest, like Scotland and Wales have. And in Mansfield, they talked about the need for a political forum. And actually, I think this also explains, although it would need further research to establish it, the difference between voting in England and Scotland. If you look at areas in Scotland with exactly similar democratic profile, they voted Remain rather than Leave. And I think the reason is that because they have the Scottish Parliament, because there's competition between the SNP and Labour, people felt they had more opportunities to express their concerns. So this is why the slogan, "Take Back Control," had such resonance. If you like, the 2016 referendum was a howl of frustration from people who hadn't ever had their voices heard. It was a kind of rejection of the status quo. And I think that take back control represents a real sense of the failures of democracy. So that's what I want to talk about it, noting, by the way, and this comes out of the figures shown by Tony as well, that actually they have even less control now than they had in 2016. So the problems have not gone away in any sense. So let me say a few words about what I think are the problems of our democracy. And then I'd like to say something about the democratic or undemocratic nature of Brexit. And then I'll end by saying, where now? I think it's very useful when thinking about democracy to build on a distinction that's often made in political theory between procedural and substantive democracy. So procedural democracy are all the rules that are in place for a democracy. It involves a rights-based, actually I'm taking this from Dahl, a rights-based rule of law, full adult suffrage, elected power holders, a plurality of parties, and civilian control of the military. Substantive participation really refers to if you like, to political equality. It refers to the ability of individuals to affect the decisions, to influence the decisions that affect their lives, to influence and participate in the decisions that affect their lives. And it also has to do with the culture of democracy, what de Tocqueville called the habits of the heart. And procedural democracy is a necessary condition for substantive democracy. You can't have substantive democracy without participation. It's not, nor actually can you, but you can have procedural democracy without substantive democracy. And it's that gap between procedural and substantive democracy, which I think is felt in most European countries. It's that gap that produces the possibility of right-wing populism, which is how I would define Brexit. In Spain, the indignados and many of the sort of protesters in 2011 made the point that we have a vote but not a voice. We call it democracy, but it isn't, is what the Spanish indignados said. There was a real sense that just voting is not enough. And there's a lot more that could be said about that, but for time reasons, I won't go on about it. So what I want to talk about is what are the reasons for the gap between procedural and substantive democracy? Why do we lack substantive democracy? Well, one obvious reason is globalization. If we live in this interconnected world, if the decisions that affect your life are taken in the headquarters of multinational corporations, they're taken in Brussels, they're taken in Washington, DC, they're taken on the laptops of financial speculators, we can go on. Then however perfect your procedural democracy, you can't influence the decisions that affect your life. And I think that is part of the story, and an obvious part of the story, but it's not the whole story, because I think globalization itself is not something determined. It was a social construction, and the move away from the state reflected real weaknesses in the nation state. So I want to say a little bit about democracy at the national level, and why that's been weakened. And when I say globalization was a consequence, well, I don't know of weaknesses, but I think, the spread of global capital there was pressure from deregulation at a national level because they wanted to create a global market. Likewise, I think it's also true that civil society, what we call the new social movements, peace movements, green movements, women's movements, found it really difficult to get through the obstacles of political parties and affect nation states, and they turned to international institutions. So it's not just an economic phenomenon. I think it's a political and civic phenomenon as well. But if I think about the weaknesses at a national level, not necessarily in order of importance, but first of all, I think neoliberalism itself, but a very particular aspect of neoliberalism, which was privatization and the contracting out culture of government. I think that's been incredibly important and is underestimated, although today and yesterday with the Pandora Papers, we're becoming more aware of its consequences. I think the state increasingly became a purchaser rather than a provider. And that had real consequences for the nature of politics. It gave rise in a number of countries to what one might call crony capitalism. And we're seeing this so much in the Brexit vote. It's really striking during the last 2 years, the way, well, in the case of PPE contracts for COVID, they were handed to Brexit supporting donors rather than to people who actually had proved competence. I don't know, you had Deloitte, the accountancy firm, taking on a big PPE contract. So this the sort of thing you tend to see in conflict countries, which I tend to study, the sort of handing of contracts to friends and supporters, is something increasingly affecting advanced countries. That's the first point. The second point is the change in political parties, and I know Simon will talk about that later on, but I think you had a shift in political parties from being sort of fora for debate to being electoral machines, sort of machines for winning government. And linked to that was the whole kind of technology of elections, the idea of focus groups, the necessity for winning the middle ground, which meant that all parties gravitated towards the centre ground. And there was a huge sense on the margins on either side of being underrepresented. So I think that's a second factor. A third factor, which I won't go into at great length, is what I call the deep state, the links of the state to the military, to the defense industry, which is particularly important in the US and in the UK and France, also in the US. And then finally, of course, the role of media and social media. We can talk about Gramsci and the role of ideology and the hegemony of certain types of ideology and how it filters through the media, and particularly in Britain, the tabloids, but also the social media. And we can talk a lot about the role of the social media in the Brexit and in recent elections, and I'll say a bit more in a minute. But I think the implications of this argument is that substantive democracy has been eroded at the national level. And actually the way forward is not just that we need substantive democracy at a regional or global level, at a European level. Paradoxically, substantive democracy at a European level would be a better way of taking back control, but also actually that we need devolution to lower levels so that people are more engaged in the local decisions that affect them. So the answer to this, which I'll come back to at the end, has to be some kind of multi-level democracy. Now, let me just turn to the referendum. Actually, the referendum itself was very weak in democratic terms, and not only in substantive terms, but also in procedural terms. It reflected the absence of a written constitution, the absence of any permanent rules for how you do this kind of thing. So what rules there were agreed by a Conservative majority in Parliament. And what were the rules? Well, the rules were European citizens couldn't vote. In Scotland, people were allowed to vote over the age of 16, but in England, it was only over the age of 18. It was agreed that a simple majority was enough, which is not usually the case in referenda on big constitutional issues. And there was no safeguard for the regions. Usually the regions have to agree as well. So for all those reasons, it was procedurally very weak. But it was also very weak in substantive terms. We all know about the social media campaigns, the role of Cambridge Analytica. We know of the roles of fake news. The NHS was going to get 350 million a week or something. Turkey was going to join the EU and flood us with Muslims. There were all these sort of endless stories that came out. And also, they were shown to have broken election expenses rules. And the paradoxical thing is that had this been an election, because they broke the rules on expenses, they would have had to run it again. But because a referendum is not an election and is only consultative, that was considered not necessary. And finally, of course, and I've just been reading about this in a new book by Martin Shaw, it was politically racist. It was racist. The immigration rhetoric was deliberately fostered by the Leave campaign. At the same time, I think there was an extraordinary weakness of the opposition. I think the opposition focused on economic threats, not on a positive future. And also, of course, Labour, led by Jeremy Corbyn, was rather ambiguous about Brexit. Now, in the immediate aftermath, there seemed to be a general consensus that the results had to be respected, even though actually nobody really knew what Brexit meant. There was an extraordinary level of ignorance about the European Union and about what our relationship with. And I mean, had we been in some different kind of political cycle, we should have said, we're not going to do anything for 2 years. We're not going to trigger Article 50. We need a consultation process, a deliberative process involving citizens' assemblies, all the kinds of things that the Irish do with their referenda. And then at the end of 2 years, we should decide again what we really want to do. But instead, absolutely everyone accepted the consensus. We have to go with Brexit. And Theresa May said Brexit means Brexit, even though nobody really knew what that meant. And actually, it was interesting listening to Jonathan, because it feels like a really hard Brexit, although, as he points out, really the only big change has been the end of free movement. Nevertheless, the end of free movement has caused all kinds of problems, which we're seeing every day in our supermarkets and in garages. And of course, terribly worrying is the growing tension in Northern Ireland. And for what is actually an insoluble problem. I mean, we could probably make it better if we committed to accepting EU health and sanitary standards. that would make it less intrusive. But nevertheless, there has to be a hard border somewhere, either in the Irish Sea or across Ireland. And I think the other problem that we had was that the consequence of all this, the consequence of this debate, was a huge victory for the Conservative Party in 2019. And I think, again, one of the big problems was that Labour was still caught up in the technology of elections, in the focus group efforts, in the attempts to somehow capture the middle ground when there was no middle ground. This was a highly polarised situation. And the result was that Labour presented an extremely weak opposition. And what we're seeing now, which is very worrying, is the centre ground moving to the right. It's very difficult for me to see how the Conservative government, this Conservative government, which is actually now a far-right Conservative government, it's a Brexit-dominated Conservative government, can actually be dislodged. I mean, they're engaging in all kinds of measures which are more familiar to among American Republicans, like introducing identity cards, like shifting boundaries, that will make it extremely difficult for any opposition party to win England, which is what it's going to have to win in the future. So let me finally turn to the implications of this argument. As I said, people in Mansfield and Pendle have less control than ever. They're facing shortages, they're facing benefit cuts, they're facing increases in national insurance. And what's more, even if we are out of the EU, we're still incredibly interconnected with the EU, and what the EU does hugely affects us. But we have less power to affect that. I mean, it's paradoxical that actually I saw a figure and that over 50% of the directives that came out of the European Commission were introduced by Britain. So the idea that we didn't have control, that we didn't have, that this distant EU was imposing regulations on us was really illusory. So now we have even less control than ever. I mean, again, Jonathan was talking about global Britain and little England, and global Britain. We lost so much, we had so much influence in the European Union, in the world as well. And I was thinking of talking about that today rather than democracy, because it's a subject dear to my heart, particularly in relation to places like Afghanistan and Somalia. But, you know, we've lost a huge, so it's much more likely to be Little Britain if you look at it in terms of overall influence on global decisions. So what does that then imply in terms of how we could overcome some of these problems? And I'm not talking exactly about Brexit, but I'm more talking about what might take back control mean. And this is, I think this story is very relevant, not just for us, but also other parts of Europe with similar declining industrial areas. I'm thinking obviously of Eastern Europe, which was hit by the decline, and East Germany in particular, but also France, where you get some of the same problems that we've experienced in Britain. The one positive thing I would say that came out of this whole story is that we have a new generation in Britain who's more educated about Europe than probably anywhere else. I think you'll probably find the most enthusiastic pro-Europeans among the young in Britain. Some of you may have seen these wonderful pictures of the huge demonstrations, but there is quite a passionately pro-European feeling among many people, of course not all in the younger generation, and that could have some effects, not only in Britain, but through all kinds of pan-European links. But I think in order to get substantial changes, we do actually also need procedural changes. And I'd like to say something about that. I think in the UK, there are two things we need. We need proportional representation. None of this would have been possible without the first past the post system. And we also need much greater devolution. This is an incredibly centralized state. Are there any possibilities for that? There's been a very active campaign for electoral reform within the Labour Party. At the vote at Labour Party conference last week, they won 80% of the constituency votes that were defeated by the unions. Actually, Keir Starmer has on many occasions said he was committed to PR, but this was not in evidence at the Labour Party conference. Anyway, there should be campaigns for PR and for devolution. But I think there's also an incredible need to get greater procedural democracy at an EU level. As a matter of fact, I think there's always been a huge weakness in substantial democracy. It's a point Spinelli made many years ago, where he said the EU lacked the substance of politics. And I think that's true. As a matter of fact, the European elections of 2019 were the first elections, and it may be a consequence of Brexit, that were fought, as it were, in much more substantive terms. In previous elections, the vote had been largely about national issues translated into Europe. I think for the first time you got a quite radical PES manifesto, and actually we did in my little unit at LSE a little study of the manifestos. And you could see a real difference of conceptions of Europe. So instead of being a vote about being for or against Europe, which is what it tended to be in the past, I think the last European elections were the first elections where different conceptions of Europe were expressed. And I think as a consequence of Brexit, even the right-wing, far-right governments don't want actually to leave the European Union, but they have a vision of the European Union as a union of nations, rather than a vision of the European Union as a mechanism for addressing social, environmental, and other challenges. Nevertheless, what I think is, if the European Union is going to go further, I think, first of all, it needs to have elected power holders. I think it's really difficult to act. Ursula von der Leyen said she wanted this commission to be a geopolitical commission. She wanted strategic autonomy. I think that's incredibly difficult when those key decisions are taken by deliberations among governments. And the role of the president is really limited unless it's either a Spitzenkandidat system or a direct election, unless those key power holders are directly accountable to people. The other aspect, which I think is really interesting and important, is that I do think if the European Union is to become more democratic, it needs to pioneer much more a different kind of democracy, a sort of 21st century transnational democracy. And I hope a lot of those ideas are going to be discussed in the Conference on the Future of Europe. But there are lots of quite exciting ideas for complementing a voting system, an electoral system, with a system of participation through, for instance, citizens' assemblies that could be online, so they could be across Europe, or there's one proposal to make Strasbourg a permanent citizens' assembly as a sort of second chamber of the European Parliament. And there are also proposals that the recovery plan should be subject to participatory budgeting. And I think all those ideas for involving people are not only important in terms of taking back control, but also actually the direction of travel on all the key issues that we face. And I've got more hopes for change in the European Union than I do for change in Britain. So all of these ideas that sound quite utopian, I'm not confident about. I'm simply being responsibly utopian. As it is, I feel rather depressed about the future of the situation. And I really fear that unless these issues are addressed, which they don't look likely to be addressed, we're going to see the continued rise of right-wing populism.
Thank you very much, Mary. Even though that's kind of a somber note to end on. Why don't we go back to Professor Jones, who looks fully recovered from his emotional attack.
No, thanks, Mike. And I do apologize for my last little disaster. What I'm going to do is start this, and then I'll try to be as concise as possible to make up for the time I wasted before. I want to make 4 very simple points that I think are going to build quite a bit on what Mary just talked about. One is about the broader transatlantic context within which Brexit took place and the many similarities between what's going on across the Atlantic and what happened within the European Union. The second is about personal relationships, or rather the personalization of politics, why it is that we end up in this story putting so much focus on specific individuals. And then I want to talk about the short-term implications of Brexit, which may not be all bad, and the longer-term structural changes that we might anticipate. And I'll end with some implications that we should watch for in order to see whether the argument that I'm going to make actually turns out empirically to make any sense. Look, if you think about the transatlantic context, what you should know is that Brexit is in many senses the result of a microcosm of the wider tensions that are taking place across the Atlantic. And what I mean by that is, if you look in the transatlantic relationship, you'll see the same kinds of frustrations that the British government expressed, frustrations about burden sharing and the relative costs and benefits of participating in shared institutions, but also frustrations about decision-making and who has decision-making authority. And one of the best lines, I think, in Theresa May's 2017 white paper on Brexit was that, of course, Britain always had its sovereignty while it was a member of the European Union. It's just sometimes it didn't feel that way. Now, this idea of feeling like you don't have sovereignty is something that I think many of my colleagues in the United States would say a lot in the transatlantic context. And it explains why you see even Democratic administrations like the Biden administration moving ahead with plans without really doing the kind of consultation you would expect. And that's because these usual frustrations tend to bubble up in the policymaking process in ways that create frictions you really would not want to see in structured institutional cooperative arenas. Now, on top of these usual frustrations, we have to accept that the transatlantic context and the European context are being affected by much wider global influences. And as a result, within those relationships, we're seeing changes in the balance of priority, but also changes in the balance of power. In the transatlantic context, we see this manifest in the shift or the pivot from the Middle East to Asia, but you can see those tensions play out in the European context as well. And as those tensions play out, the frustrations that we usually experience, those usual frustrations, either in the transatlantic context or in the European context, become ever increasingly more prominent, ever increasingly more irritating. And along the way, and this is the point I would underscore, domestic politics achieves a kind of a primacy that it didn't used to have, or at least didn't used to manifest in the same sense. And here Mary's story about globalization and adjustment, I think, is crucial. Let's not forget, as Mary was highlighting these advanced industrial regions and the sense of powerlessness they felt, that the trade relationship between Canada and the European Union almost collapsed because of the politics that was taking place in southern Belgium, in the most or the earliest industrialized part of Belgium, as it was reacting to what it felt like the powerlessness that agreement represented. And it's not only the peculiarities of Belgian politics that came into play. I think one of the most striking things in the transatlantic context was the extent to which the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which was meant to be a big piece of low-hanging fruit, promoting regulatory convergence in order to facilitate jobs and growth, turned out to be surprisingly controversial in a number of different dimensions. And while it's true that the Trump administration shelved that deal, it's unlikely that any administration in the United States would have been able to get it through the Senate. And indeed, it's not really clear that a mixed agreement like that would have found acceptance in the European Union either. And so those tensions, that primacy of domestic politics, I think we could say are in many respects ubiquitous. Now, what makes this such an important point to focus on is the extent to which our interdependence is not something that's neutral in this whole conversation. And it's also not something that's not prone to manipulation. On the contrary, one of the most important articles in international political economy that was published in the last decade is an article by Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman that came out in 2019 in a journal called International Security. And it looks at the way the United States has used the institutions that were created to foster interdependence in order to begin asserting its authority. And the illustrations that they use include dollar clearing in SWIFT. The SWIFT story, I think, is important because it shows how even cooperative arrangements, and SWIFT is organized as a cooperative, even cooperative arrangements can be manipulated in ways that make everybody else decidedly uncomfortable. The Europeans were uncomfortable initially with the SWIFT exclusion that was imposed on Iran. They were doubly uncomfortable when the Trump administration came back and undid the JCPOA to impose that SWIFT exclusion again. Now, these kinds of tensions are worth highlighting because if they exist in the transatlantic relationship, it's unsurprising that you would see fights over institutions in the European context as well. Now, in saying that, I think we have to accept the argument that Mary is making about these broad social movements and the impact of globalization is part of the story, but there are also specific individual choices that are part of the story as well. And those specific individual choices, like David Cameron's choice to hold an in or out referendum, have many significant consequences that flow from them. And indeed, the broad social movements and the specific individual choices interact in ways that are common both at the transatlantic level and in the context of Brexit as well. So when we talk about right-wing populism as being behind the Brexit decision or the decision to leave the European Union, what we should recognize is that that kind of populism is another ubiquitous force that we're seeing at work in the transatlantic context. And the thing about these populist political leaders is not that they break rules by accident, it's that they consciously seek to disintermediate institutions, to take these institutional arrangements and to replace them with the right to make these individual choices. So when Mary tells the story about how the Conservative Party right now is trying to re-engineer Britain's constitutional arrangement so that it can remain in power, that's not a unique story to Britain. On the contrary, it's part and parcel of the way these populist movements channel discontent into new kinds of procedural arrangements that allow them to continue to stay in power long after their sell-by dates. And what's interesting, if you go back into the 1970s, for example, is that this is the dark side of what we call leadership, right? Leadership is all about breaking rules. It's all about changing institutions. We have the light side of leadership that we argue is favorable in the context of engineering market structural reforms, for example. How often have you heard laments that there are no leaders in Europe capable of reforming their economies in ways that are politically unpopular. But the reality is that that same kind of leadership that can engineer reform is the leadership that can re-engineer constitutional arrangements to make them less than democratic. And so when we look at what's going on in the Brexit context, we have to be attentive to the role that leadership plays and the way that leadership will do the things that Mary describes, and indeed the way it's happening on both sides of the Atlantic. So when we ask people, why is it that the Biden administration is not being so consultative right now? Why does it seem to go it alone? Because that's something that US administrations going all the way back into the 1990s have consciously made as a choice to favor coalitions of the willing, to get out of bombing by committee, and to ensure that the United States has, as Donald Trump put it so carefully before the United Nations General Assembly, time and again, each time he spoke, the United States has the sovereignty that it requires to succeed. Now, in that context, one thing to realize is that there is also an element in which what these political decisions are going to result in creates uncertainty. And that uncertainty is a form of power that you can exercise. You see this all the time in the way that Boris Johnson and his team are negotiating the situation with the Northern Irish Protocol, and the way that they hold this uncertainty out in order to create the impression that there may be a big controversy that's just around the corner in order to exercise a certain amount of leverage and in order to assert the fact that their best alternative to a negotiated agreement is to just pull themselves out completely. And this kind of power exercise is unfortunately a very powerful source of instability, because these specific individual choices that leaders make result in significant changes that, that we can see reordering the world that we live in today. Well, what are the short-term implications? Obviously, in order to catalog the short-term implications, you have to speculate on many levels. What I'd like to do, rather than try to catalog them in any great detail, is just focus on the European context and ask, well, wait a minute, is the political economy of Brexit a good thing or a bad thing for Europe? Put another way, what if Britain had stayed in the European Union throughout the whole pandemic that we just experienced? Would we be talking now about Europe's Hamiltonian moment and the success of next generation EU, which is still under judgment, but which many people regard as a success simply by dint of the fact that it was agreed in the first place, or would this situation look much, much worse? And I think the answer lies in the contrast between the last crisis and the most recent one. The last crisis resulted in the creation of what was called the European Stability Mechanism. That is the collective bailout mechanism that was supposed to help governments in trouble in times of crisis. And yet that mechanism had to be created outside of the European treaties because the British government of the day refused to allow the mechanism to exist within Europe's institutional framing. Now, the result of it being created outside the European treaties is that the governance of the European Stability Mechanism and its mission was excessively influenced by the creditor countries in that crisis, and the use of the European Stability Mechanism as a bailout instrument caused considerable agony in those countries that accessed it. Which means if you fast forward to the present crisis, none of those countries, and even other countries that saw the experience of the countries that received the bailout, were willing to receive funding from the ESM. So if the ESM were the only institution that we could have accessed in the context of this pandemic, it's unlikely it would have been used. And indeed, the money that was made available through the ESM remains untouched to this day. By contrast, Next Generation EU is something that was done within the treaty framework using the European Commission. This is something that I find very hard to imagine that any British government would have accepted. I could be wrong about that. Again, this is clearly speculative, but as we celebrate Europe's newfound fiscal solidarity, I think it's reasonable to believe that one of the short-term implications of Brexit is that this was easier to achieve than it would have been if Britain had remained. But what about the longer-term structural changes. Now, this is going to be even more speculative, so I'm going to give you a different illustration that will suggest, I believe, what kinds of longer term implications we might expect. And I'm going to use the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US alliance that was just announced in order to flesh that out a bit. You see, the interesting thing about AUKUS is not why Britain and the United States did a deal with Australia without consulting the French and all the rest. The interesting question is why the British have American-style nuclear propulsion technology to begin with. This is the most sophisticated way of delivering a nuclear deterrent, and it's not immediately obvious that even with very close allies, the United States would be willing to share it today, let alone have been willing to share it in the past. And the answer lies in two different things. One is the differing Anglo-French reactions to the Suez crisis. When the United States stopped the Anglo-French intervention in the Suez, the French withdrew from the transatlantic relationship and the British leaned into it. So by 1958, the Eisenhower administration was willing to begin a program of investing in British nuclear propulsion based on American models, but that program was very slow to take off. It didn't have dramatic implications, and the British nuclear deterrent was going to be based on other technology held by a different branch of the military service. In fact, it was going to be in the air service, and it was going to be based on Skybolt. Now, the thing that's interesting about Skybolt is that the Kennedy administration did something very similar to the British that the Biden administration just did to the French, which is that the Kennedy administration canceled the Skybolt program in November of 1962 without consulting Harold Macmillan and his government. Bob McNamara, in a conversation that we had towards the end of his life, argued that he had done the consultations, but it's clear that the British government didn't feel like they'd been consulted enough. And indeed, Macmillan demanded an interview with Kennedy in order to fix that. And the result of that interview, which took place in Nassau in the Bahamas in December of 1962, was that the Kennedy administration gave to the British government retrofitted Polaris missile technology that would fit in the nuclear or in the diesel submarines that they had, and then accelerated the development of their own nuclear propulsion system so that they had fully fledged Polaris submarines by 1968. Now, the important thing about this is that that decision at Nassau to give Britain access to this technology is directly contributing to the British or to the French veto of Britain's application to join the European Community in 1963, to the French withdrawal from the NATO integrated military command structure in 1966, and to the troubled relationship that Britain had with the European Union from the early 1960s up until the present. Now, the argument is not that Brexit took place because of the Nassau Accords, but the argument is to say that there were long-term structural consequences out of the solution to that particular scandal, the Skybolt scandal, long-term structural consequences that still resonate today. And it would not be surprising if Brexit and AUKUS have similar long-lasting structural consequences that will resonate well into the future. So if this is true, what are the things that we should look for? I'm not really trying to make a conclusion to this argument, but I am willing to make three bets. And the first bet is directly related to the political economy of Brexit, and that is that regulatory convergence across the Atlantic will be even more complicated and more controversial and harder to intermediate now than it was when TTIP was being negotiated. Right? That's not to say that regulatory convergence wasn't hard before. We know that the transatlantic context makes this kind of regulatory convergence challenging, but it will be harder. And as a consequence, that low-hanging fruit I alluded to earlier is going to be ever further from our reach. By the same token, as Britain begins to assert its regulatory independence, it's doing so in the context of a changing financial technological environment. And my expectation is that that innovation is likely to accelerate as new actors use new technologies to outpace regulatory restraints. Again, this is not only about Brexit, But I think there is an influence, and it's one that I find worrying, because we may be looking at a movement toward a financial technological environment that's much more unstable and much harder to regulate than the one we would have had otherwise, with a strong European Union regulatory center to it. And having said that, I don't want to say the news is all bad. I do believe that the European Union may grow stronger internally. That's a conditional may, because there are many things that the European Union member states can do to screw that up. But they may grow stronger internally as a result of next generation EU. But as they do that, I suspect they're also going to be less useful to, or maybe better, less available to the United States as a global partner in dealing with China, Russia, climate action, or global security. And here too, Brexit is at best a contributing factor, but I would argue, particularly in the context of AUKUS, the contribution is significant. Again, these are bets, right? I'm speculating. I hope I'm wrong about all these things, but I think it'll be worth keeping track of them, because it could be that the political economy of Brexit projected to the wider term really does result in many ways, or at least contribute to a dismantling of that thing we used to call rather affectionately the West. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Eric. I guess we're entering another somber note, and fortunately, the next presentation has a much happier title of Brexit and the Breakup of the United Kingdom. So Professor Ian McLean from Nuffield College at Oxford University and the RCEA. Ian, you're on mute.
Right, I got you back. First of all, there have been considerable problems with this computer and my audio. Am I actually being heard clearly?
Yes.
Yes, says somebody, so I'll press ahead. So let me share my screen. And it's this one. And I needs to go to the start. Okay, I hope that people can see that. I have to start with this disclaimer, because since my appointment at RCEA, I've had an even more surprising appointment as a member of the Fiscal Commission of Northern Ireland. And as Mary in particular has already mentioned, there are a number of rather potentially difficult issues in that territory, some of which I will talk about, but of course not representing the Commission. So I'm going to take you through the bits that are complementary to what we've already discussed. I did notice right at the beginning that Northern Ireland was not even on the maps that Tony presented. It was on some of them, but it was not on many of them, which I think may say something, among much else, about what both English politicians, and I use the word English advisedly, and English academics think about Northern Ireland. So I'm going to talk about Scotland, I'm going to talk about Northern Ireland. I'm going to talk about the fallout after the Scottish referendum of 2014 and the Brexit referendum. I'm going to talk about the UK government's current strategy, which some have labelled muscular unionism. I'm going to have an excursion into public law and legal theory about the revival of Dicey and the eclipse of the McCormicks, which I will explain in a bit. I will present some data, which is not mine, but it is from the best compilation site, What Scotland Thinks for Scotland. There is much less good, reliable opinion data on Northern Ireland, but I will present it from the best available source, which is Northern Ireland Life and Times. I will go on to constitutional issues, finish about fiscal issues. I will finally finish, if permitted, on what turns out to be a remarkable synergy with what Eric has just been telling us about, which is the future of the UK nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarines. So This is factual data, which will be familiar to most people on the call. In 2014, the UK government permitted the Scottish government to hold a referendum. The UK government, in giving that permission, was confident that the answer would be no, and the answer was no. This, as many people have observed, gave Prime Minister Cameron what turned out to be misplaced confidence that he could do the same trick again, and the June 2016 referendum had the result shown. It's important to note, and it's been briefly touched on by earlier speakers, but not really examined, that two territories bucked the pattern. In Scotland, Remain got 62%, in Northern Ireland, Remain got 56%. Now, within Scotland, the pattern, rather as Tony hinted in the first presentation, is that at each level of the indicators that Tony told us about, density of graduates, median wage, and so on, for instance, the more graduates you had, the better educated the population, the higher the Remain vote. That slope was the same in Scotland as in the rest of GB, but the intercept was different. The baseline Remain vote was higher. Remain was advocated by the hegemonic party in Scotland, the SNP, although it was not unanimous and its followers were not unanimous. In Northern Ireland, the factors seem to be more cultural than material, although again they overlay material matters. The Remain vote was overwhelmingly strong in the Catholic nationalist community, those who identify as that, I'll come to that in a minute, and Leave was predominant in the Protestant Unionist community, again with the same gradient within communities that the more educated and the higher median wage, the higher the Remain vote. The UK general election of 2017 produced a Conservative minority government. Like the Spanish Inquisition, nobody had expected that. And one effect, as shown in this slide, is that the Conservative minority had to get support from some other party, at least for confidence and supply, in order to be able to pass budgets. It couldn't get it from Labour, fundamentally opposed. It couldn't get it from the SNP because the terms would have been too hard for the Conservative and Unionist party to accept. It couldn't get it from the Northern Ireland nationalist community because all 7 of the nationalist MPs elected in that election belonged to the Sinn Féin party, which for a century has refused to send its MPs to Westminster. So the only place it could turn was to the Northern Ireland Unionists of the Democratic Unionist Party. For 2 years, therefore, the DUP was pivotal, and this affected the politics which has happened from then to now. The May government, as it then was, produced a draft withdrawal agreement, and the essential of the agreement between UK and EU, with the US looking on, is that it was vital to preserve the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement of 1998. In other words, that there was to be no hard border on the island of Ireland. Now, this immediately set in train quite a number of implications, of which Brexit politicians, to be frank, seemed unaware.
Ian?
Yeah.
We don't, your slides aren't changing. Did you mean to change your slides? We can't see that.
I should be on slide 5, is it not?
No, we're still on slide 1. I just sent you a message about it.
Oh, thanks. Right. I'll go back to the slideshow and I'll operate from that. I'm very sorry, people. This says what I've already said, that there was the outline of my presentation. There was the timeline I've spoken to, showing that the Conservatives depended on the DUP, the Northern Ireland Unionist Party, between 2017 and 19. And back where I was, I'm very sorry about that. The withdrawal agreement of the version agreed between UK and EU in 2017 fundamentally said that as there was to be no hard border in Ireland, that had the effect that as Northern Ireland must stay in the customs union and single market. The 2017 version was that GB, the rest of the UK, must also stay in the customs union and the single market in practice, in form, whatever the wording said. That was rejected by the UK Parliament on 3 occasions, with the opposites coming round to defeat it: Conservative rebels, the DUP, and the Labour Party, which, as Mary told us, was very divided at the time, but certainly included people who wanted the whole UK to stay in the customs union. So the opposition eventually led to the resignation of Prime Minister May and her being succeeded by Prime Minister Johnson, elected only initially by Conservative Party members, but then his election confirmed by the 2019 general election, which produced a Conservative majority government, no longer dependent on the DUP. So, freed from that particular constraint, Mr. Johnson, while announcing that no British Prime Minister would ever agree to a border down the Irish Sea, signed a withdrawal agreement which did exactly that. It's already been mentioned by previous speakers, but since the border has to be somewhere between EU and not EU, if it's not going to be across the island of Ireland, it has to be down the Irish Sea. That's kind of Geography 101. Now, another thing that has been happening is the UK government trying to win hearts and minds, is what I happen to believe is a doomed effort, by, as Welsh politicians have called it, planting the Union flag on things which are going on, especially in Scotland and Wales. They have a good argument to say that it was the UK government that has bailed out the whole UK in, for instance, furlough and vaccine supply. But instead, they've gone for what I think is a much weaker argument rhetorically, by going for things like city deals and saying this is brought to you by Boris Johnson's government or by the UK government. Scottish nationalists frequently say that the best thing that Boris Johnson can ever do to Scottish independence is turn up in Scotland. And we have data from both jurisdictions showing that politicians in the UK Conservative government are among the least popular of those surveyed. Now, the Scottish and Welsh devolution settlement of the late 1990s involved something called the Suez Convention, which said that the UK would not normally, that is the phrase used in the legislation, not normally legislate in devolved areas without the consent of the devolved parliament. A lot turns out to hang on that word normally. The Scottish Parliament refused consent to the 2018 Withdrawal Act that embodied the then withdrawal agreement. All 3 Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish assemblies refused their consent to the 2020 Withdrawal Act, even though in Wales there was a pro-Brexit majority. The UK government, this is an engineering abbreviation, it stands for bollocks on regardless, and simply ignored the fact that the Suez mechanism was not applied. In constitutional litigation will be familiar to some people, Miller 1. The Scottish government attempted to argue that the behaviour of the UK government then proposing to implement Article 50 without parliamentary approval was unlawful, not only on the grounds which actually succeeded, which was that it was held that you did have to consult Parliament, but on another set of grounds, which was that the Suez consent of the Scottish Parliament was not sought. The judges tossed that one out and said the word normally in the Suez Convention and the Scotland Act 2016 is a matter of political judgment, and it is not the role of the court to make a political judgment. So this revealed the Suez Convention as being empty and I've now got something I didn't want, and has really brought back the Victorian jurist A.V. Dicey to the front of public law and constitutional argument. In 1885, he argued, by the way, is my slide sequencing now working? Is one appearing that says Dicey v. McCormack?
Yes, it is. Yes,
thank you. So Dicey's argument in 1885 was that parliamentary sovereignty implies that no parliament may bind its successor. And one implication of that is that statutes which purport to be constitutional and which may purport to be entrenched, such as the Acts of Union between Scotland and England of 1707, which state that some things must remain as they are for all time coming, were of no force. Now, Dicey later changed his mind because he really, really hated devolution to Ireland. And the fact that Dicey was fundamentally inconsistent throughout his career seems to bother public lawyers rather less than it bothers people like me as a historian and a scientist. And the Scottish politician, John McCormack, active in the Scottish nationalist movement in the 1950s, took a case to the Scottish courts about something that now seems ridiculously trivial, which was the title of the Queen. As there had never been an Elizabeth I of Scotland, she should be Elizabeth II down first. The court tossed that, but in the having tossed it, it then produced the senior judge in Scotland at the time, then produced what intellectually is a devastating argument to the effect that the canons of parliamentary construction, of legal construction, as he said, suggest that some statutes are more important than others. Some statutes should be entrenched. This argument has had a bit of a run in the courts in the last decade, applied not so much to the Treaty of Union 1707 as to the European Communities Act 1972. Well, that has all crashed and burned. The McCormacks were right about history, but they have lost the political argument in the age of muscular unionism. And even since I prepared these slides, that has had another round in a judgment released today, saying that two acts of the Scottish Parliament, one of which was incorporating the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, were ultra vires, they were beyond the power, and stressing again that the Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland may be a bit different here, but the Scotland and Wales acts did not remove the power of the Westminster Parliament to legislate for Scotland and Wales. This goes down a bomb in Scottish nationalist and Welsh nationalist circles. Going then to the conflict between the two referendums, an argument put by the no side in 2014, i.e. no Scottish independence, was if you want to stay in the EU, you must vote against Scottish independence because the EU would not admit an independent Scotland immediately. That was valid at the time, but of course, 2 years later, less than 2 years later, it flipped. And now the Scottish nationalists can very plausibly say, if you want to get back into the EU, the only way is to vote for independence. The current UK government, says it will not permit a second independence referendum. The Scottish government is tempted to go it alone, or people in Scotland are tempted to go it alone, but it's clear that the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is extremely cautious. I think she's looking over her shoulder at Catalonia all the time. The circumstances are not the same, but an independence referendum conducted without Westminster authority would not result in Nicola being jailed, but it might result in her and everybody else who voted it having to pay the legal costs which would result from a private litigant saying that the attempt to hold a referendum was ultra vires, which, fortified by today's judgment, it is. I'm now going to go on to what Scotland thinks data. I hope it's clear enough for people to see on screen. This is the time series on would you vote for Scottish independence or not? You can see there is a blip immediately after 2016 that the yes side does gain some support, but then it settles down to 50-50. And to an approximation, it's still 50-50, which is another reason for Ms. Sturgeon's caution. Scottish public opinion is, as this one shows, very flat. I mean, this is a very flat graph, isn't it? Time series. Should the UK rejoin the EU or stay out of the EU? Scottish opinion is still pro-EU. This one is rather busy. When, if ever, do you think there should be another Scottish independence referendum? Well, the modal answer is never, which you might say is not very interesting because those who oppose independence also tend to oppose an independence referendum. But people tend to think, people who don't think that tend to think it may happen within 1 or 2 years. I think it may, but it won't within 1 or 2 years. And the reasons are expressed in this and some later slides. This is still what Scotland thinks. Most Scots think that Scotland would be financially worse off if it became an independent. And that opinion is well grounded. For over 40 years, the slogan of the Scottish nationalists was, "It's Scotland's oil." Scotland was not getting the proceeds, or it was only getting its population share, not its geographical share of the proceeds of oil taxation. Once it became independent, it would control that and off it would go. This allowed the SNP, both in opposition and in government, to ignore difficult questions about debt, deficit, and currency. And unfortunately, oil revenue went to zero in 2016. I mean, it will have bounced back, but nowhere near the levels that it was at the heyday of It's Scotland's oil. So the SNP and advocates of independence can no longer hide from the fiscal reality. Now, it's relevant here that the Scottish nationalist movement split this year, that the former First Minister Alex Salmond went off and formed a new party called ALAPA, and it could be expressed in the terms analogous to the German Greens, that Salmond and his party are the Fundis, who want Scottish nationalism above all else. Sturgeon and her leadership cadre are the Realos, who are aware of the fiscal numbers. The fact that Alba won no seats in the Scottish Parliament strengthens the hand of the Realos. And here are the dire numbers. Public spending in Scotland on the latest numbers, £18,000 per head. Tax receipts, 11.5, 63% of the expenditure. A humongous gap to fill. And of course, exacerbated by COVID, but it's not just a COVID effect, as this graph, I hope, shows. The main number to look at is the red compared to the green, so that since the 1980s, Scotland has run, were it to be treated as an independent state, a bigger fiscal deficit than the UK as a whole. And there's no easy way around that. There's North Sea oil revenue. It actually went negative in 2016. I don't have 2021 data. It would have gone up a bit, but nowhere near what would make it close the fiscal gap. There is, however, a wild card, and this is where my talk interacts with Eric's. And I'll go straight to the, this is an old relief map. The HM Naval Base Clyde, which contains the UK nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarine fleet, is in the two sea lochs, fjords, in the middle of the picture. The one to the right, the Gairloch, and the long one to the left, Loch Long. And nowhere else in the UK has the physical geography that is comparable to that. So therefore, there is nowhere else in the UK where, because as you can see, there are mountains. If the mountains are high, the fjords are deep. And so the successors to the Polaris that Eric spoke about can go in and out, can go about their business in deep water currently with current technology undetected. So where could they go? There's nowhere else in the UK with the physical attributes of the west of Scotland. They could go to France. They could go to the USA. These have issues which were thoroughly aired in Eric's talk. Or, of course, I say of course, but the continuing UK in the event of Scottish independence could negotiate for a sovereign base so that Faslane and Coulport remained UK territory. They did that in Ireland, 1921 to 38. And there are other examples of sovereign bases. I give 3 in this slide: Cyprus, Sevastopol, Guantanamo. These may be thought to be unsatisfying options. And so one option which might happen in the event of Scottish independence is the Scottish government saying, okay, we'll let you stay here if you write off our share of inherited debt. And that would be a minimum requirement. It would be necessary, but not sufficient for Scotland to be a viable independent state in terms of tax and spending. Quickly going on to Ireland. I've already said the Good Friday Agreement committed the parties to maintain an open land border in Ireland. There is now inescapably a border in the Irish Sea, at least for 2 categories. One is goods at risk of entering the single market by going across the land border from Northern Ireland to the Republic, and also for SBS checks, sanitary and phytosanitary. And those of us who have been working in this area for 2 or 3 years are astonished and appalled at the slowness of politicians to wake up to these issues. As most of you will know, the UK government is now trying to renege on the oven-ready deal that it's negotiated. Will this move the needle on a united Ireland? Very quickly, the constitutional position in UK law is that the Secretary of State must, and that's the word in the statute, as a consequence of 1998, hold a referendum if at any time it appears to him that a majority of those voting will express support for a united Ireland. Republic of Ireland will probably, under its constitution, have to hold a referendum as well. One intriguing possibility, which I leave with you without trying to comment further now, is what happens if Northern Ireland votes yes and the Republic votes no. The probability of a united Ireland being supported by the people of Northern Ireland has always, since 1921, seemed vanishingly low. Some factors make it seem slightly more likely. And here, the data are infuriatingly variable. I'm going here to the best data source, Northern Ireland Light and Times, which, as you will see there, the first thing that shows is that the proportion identifying as neither unionist nor nationalist is getting on for half of the Northern Ireland population. This is bound to be significant as it works its way through, but would you support an independent united Ireland? The NILT data say reunify with the rest of Ireland only 20%. Other polls asking what must be subtly different questions have produced a very wide range of numbers. One poll actually produced a majority in favour of united Ireland. So it's very hard to detect where Northern Ireland opinion really is. Where will it go? This one is probably rather too small to see easily, but we are hearing both the UK government and the unionist parties in Northern Ireland saying that the Northern Ireland Protocol is intolerable, it must go. There is a high ratio of noise to signal there. If the protocol goes, there has to be something else. And the something else has to deal with the SBS and the goods at risk of entering the EU issues somehow. But there isn't that much party opinion polling. But what there is, this is the latest I can find, shows that the largest party by party preference is Sinn Féin, the representative of the more radical wing of the nationalist movement. The previously dominant on the Protestant side, DUP, is in deep trouble, or was at the time of this poll, splitting its vote with 2 other unionist parties. There has been an attempt to have a unionist pact ahead of the elections that are coming up in Northern Ireland next May. That has crashed. So it is likely on current numbers that the Sinn Féin will be the largest party and will therefore supply the First Minister. What has received less notice, I think, is that in the right-hand column, parties support for parties which are in favour of the protocol is actually higher than support for parties which are against. The numbers are not quite as extreme as I show them, because since I prepared that slide, the UUP, the relatively moderate Unionist Party, has come out against the protocol. But to cut to the chase, if you look at the fiscal numbers, I mean, the Northern Ireland on its own would do as badly or worse than Scotland on its own. If, however, you had a united Ireland, you could have, well, I'll go to my last slide. Now, right at the beginning of this seminar, Tony Venables quite rightly warned us against using regional GDP per head as a marker. And there's a particular problem in the case of the Republic of Ireland, because that very high GDP per head in UK pounds, £60,000, making it seem that it's more than twice as rich per head as Northern Ireland. That's not reliable. That's because Amazon books its profits in the Republic, and even at the derisory corporation tax rate that the Republic charges, the GDP per head appears to be high. But those numbers, if they were reliable, would show that it would actually be fiscally quite easy for a united Ireland to come about. Another way of cutting the data is how much would the tax burden in the Republic have to go up in order to get the standards of service delivery and equated across the territories, probably by about 14%. That's a large number. It brings back the spectre, if you will, of Northern Ireland voting yes and the Republic voting no to unification. In current Republic polls, Sinn Féin is also shown as the largest party. It's historically in favour of United Ireland. That has been its raison d'etre. But United Ireland sentiment may crumble slightly in the south. But I leave you with the thought that this could be, like the reunification of Germany in 1990, a larger unit, more than twice the population, and considerably more than the GDP per head, even though not really twice, is willing to take some pain to absorb a smaller and fiscally poorer unit. And so if I wanted to make a contrarian prediction, it might be that a united Ireland would come sooner than an independent Scotland. As a political scientist, of course, I'm not taking a view on whether either of these things should happen. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. That brings us to our final presentation by Professor Simon Usherwood of the University of Surrey. So whose panel will be on presentation will be on Brexit's impact on UK political parties. Simon.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thanks, Ian, for that. Let me just reward your patience by sharing just one slide with you. I'm not going to do the full slide deck, which is available on the RCEA website for you to look. I thought you might just like a man in the JCB, because I think that probably encapsulates the key argument that I want to make when talking about party politics and its relationship to Brexit, which is that at one level, Brexit has clearly been the predominant preoccupation of political life and party political life in the UK for at least the last 5 years. And yet at another level, its impact seems to be more debatable, more tenuous than might have been imagined if we'd been having this conversation, say, 2 years ago. And the argument for that is really that the European issue has never really been fully internalized into the British party political system. The European policy, European Union policy, has always been as a function of domestic party politics, that you've not really seen an emergence of a consensual national strategy about European policy emerging in the UK in the way that you have in many other member states. So there's not this kind of French project about amplification of national interests through the European system in the way that Eric talked about before, post Suez. You don't have that return to Europe narrative that you find in Central and Eastern Europe. Instead, membership of the EEC and EU in the UK was very much more a question of having to deal with a lack of alternatives as we go along. So the result of this is then primarily that what we have is two key drivers in explaining policy and the developments that have gone on. Firstly, internal intra-party competition and control, particularly of the two main parties, and then attempts to gain inter-party advantage in the context of the quite flexible electoral arrangements that Mary talked about earlier on. The difference during this period has been that the EU has been much more salient to voters, and therefore it makes sense for parties to talk and frame their arguments around that. And also the referendum gave the opportunity to use it as a hook on which to hang longer term trends that have been taking place in the UK. And I think this is the important point, that the UK system, whilst it is unique in its fetishization of the European question as a frame for debate, it still is undergoing the same kinds of changes, same kinds of developments that we've seen across Western Europe and across democracies around the world. So we're thinking here about the rise of populist rhetoric and action. We're thinking also here about the challenges and the weaknesses of catch-all parties in that long period since the 1960s, 1970s. So I think if we want to understand why we had so much disruption during the period since the 2015 general election, which opened this process, and yet we've ended up with an electoral, a party political system that at one level looks very similar to what we had 6 years ago, with two large parties and then a small number of smaller parties around the edges. The reason for that is that the European issue never really sat well with the party political system that exists in the UK. So this is most obvious with Labour and Conservative parties, where within both parties you had significant splits in terms of preferences and policy priorities, which had to be fought over and explain a lot of the tension and uncertainty around European policy that's been present ever since 1973. So we have here a problem where we have a major issue. We have, as Mary's talked about, a referendum which was fought in a way which was not, well, at the very least was not satisfactory, but particularly in terms of producing a policy, that it gave a decision but without a rationale. And just in answer to the question, I'm not sharing any slides here. I'm just I'm going to be getting me because you've won in life. That pressure to try and change the party political system at one point in the post-referendum period produced substantial support for other parties, and most obviously the rise of UKIP and its successor, the Brexit Party, and then its successor, less so Reform, contained the seeds of a realignment of the party political system. And we can see that perhaps most clearly in the 2019 European elections, where the two most successful parties were the Brexit Party and the Liberal Democrats, the two parties that had the fewest internal divisions on the European issue and were polarized in that leave remain kind of position. But the reversion within the year, within that calendar year, to the strongest result for the Conservative Party in living memory, I think really highlights three factors that limited and have pushed back that realignment. Firstly, most obviously, is the electoral system, that the first past the post system, for the many shortcomings that it has, persists precisely because of its shortcomings, that it rewards winning parties very handsomely, and it's a strong disincentive to change that when you actually have the reins of power, or a chance of the reins of power falling into your hands. The second issue that I think limited the fundamental restructuring was that ambiguity that a couple of the previous speakers have talked about what is Brexit. So in many levels, we haven't got any further than Brexit means Brexit, which means that a large proportion of the time since the referendum has been about trying to co-opt the meaning of Brexit for narrow political agendas. And again, if the historical failure of European policy in the UK was about not constructing a consensual strategy, then the post-referendum period was exactly the same. And Theresa May and then Boris Johnson both pursued a very particular course through that, which was by turns alienating, but also was unlikely to gain wider traction and allow for that broader realignment. And ultimately, I think the third factor that's limited the impact is a rapidly declining level of public interest in the European issue. If you want to take one slogan away, we go back to that slide, which is about get Brexit done. It's a really successful political slogan for Johnson because it encapsulates the frustration with the process. It doesn't really matter what Brexit is, but we just want to not think about it anymore so we can think about other things. Take your pick of any of the slogans that have already been mentioned, such as levelling up. So in consequence, what we have is a system that is either in a state of denial about the European issue, or hasn't got the salience to make that issue cut through. So let's take the denial. Eric talked a bit about the Tories' approach of a kind of a madman theory of negotiating, that the peril of what might go wrong if the protocol were to be pushed over by activating Article 16 is an illusion, that it's not a credible strategy for the party, because the EU knows that there's not actually a viable alternative at this stage. It's not to say that the protocol is unproblematic, but it's to say that it's the least problematic of the options that are out there. And I think indeed the Tory party knows itself that that is the situation, which is why we hear a lot of words, a lot of rhetoric, but not a lot of substance. So for the Conservative government, and I think this is true for as long as this government exists, pretty much regardless of who's in number 10, there is this congenital inability to acknowledge any form of cooperation with the European Union. So I think on substance, there is a degree of willingness to do things, but it must be presented as completely unrelated to the EU. And that's a real problem for the future negotiations, as well as for the operationalization of the two treaties that we have. Similarly, Labour has its own problem about the European issue. If you listen to Keir Starmer's speech, or you read his long pamphlet that he produced ahead of the party conference a fortnight ago, you hear hardly any discussion of Brexit. And when you do, his slogan is make Brexit work. Now, again, this doesn't come with any strategy for actually doing that. It doesn't come with any comprehensive policy. If you probe the shadow cabinet, they don't really have any ideas beyond vague hopes that just their mere arrival in power would somehow open the doors to making things all right. And again, this difficulty for Labour about trying to acquire the old Labour voters that it's lost in the north of England, that red wall that has been talked about so much in the last couple of years, is very difficult if they are seen to be, or allow themselves to be painted as wanting to undo the referendum. So the strategy that's taken is largely to not get into that and try and talk about other things with limited success. If that's the denial side of it, we also have this problem for those parties which have much clearer positions about Europe, about the EU, and how that works. The Brexit Party Reform Party has essentially dropped off the radar. It gets very minimal success in opinion polls. It has no media presence. Nigel Farage, the last time anyone's seen him, he was tweeting about trying to find fuel and then getting hit by a van, his car, not him. And that's about the most successful bit of media profile that he's had in the last 5 months or so. By contrast, Liberal Democrats have started to see some reacquisition of public support, rebuilding that third-party status that they held for a long time. But the most striking example of that, which was their winning of a by-election in what was historically a very safe Conservative seat, was framed not at all around the European issue. Instead, it was based around local issues, about planning, about transport, high-speed train link that passes through. So a reversion to their classical strategy of fighting on hyper-local issues rather than on this frame that they took about a very pro-European position, which was so dominant during the Brexit period. So success for them doesn't look to be to go heavy and hard on the European issue, but rather to leave that to one side. So if I'm going to pull this together, if we have a narrative around Brexit, it's not that Brexit has disappeared from party politics. It's either about trying to put the decision in the past. So this past week at the Conservative Party conference, you've had talk about how the UK and Boris Johnson himself has got Brexit done. And you might be surprised when you'd heard that. But the narrative is this is now in the past, this is closed off and we can put it to one side. Or alternatively, you still have those campaigners from the referendum on the Remain side who want to revisit that decision and who are trying to think about reopening that kind of discussion, which is unlikely to gain much traction in the broad political landscape. That discussions about building a new consensus around a European policy seems to be largely absent from the political narrative and the party political narrative. However, I think the consequence of that is that the European issue will remain a running sore in party politics in the UK for the foreseeable future. If nothing else, the whole episode of Brexit has highlighted the shortcomings and the failures of the current party political system, as well as all the other aspects that colleagues have been talking about in this panel in terms of policy and the constitutional settlements and the integrity of the union and democracy. All of these things have been highlighted as stresses and strains on the system that the system has not really been able to adequately resolve. And notwithstanding the fact that COVID has profoundly muddied the waters about what is the fault of Brexit, it's precisely because there will be that ambiguity. And as those long term costs and lost opportunities that Jonathan alluded to earlier on become more evident, then I think we will see that we'll have a revisiting of that European policy. So at the very least, I think we have to go through at least one more cycle as we get a post-conservative government, whatever point that is and whoever that is, working out how much they want to rebase the relationship with the EU. So Brexit was not a resolution of the long-term problems of the European dimension in party politics, but rather the next stage. And I think that we have a lot more room to run before we reach a resolution. But what I think we can say is that given we've had a reassertion of the historic party political system, it's unlikely to be a realignment around the European issues and new cleavage. However, I think all the issues, those secular problems about declining trust, about populism, about the problems of catch-all parties, will continue to be problems here in the UK, and that might open up some new opportunities, which we might talk about later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. We're a little bit behind time. I think we can just thank the entire panel for fascinating discussion. And if we were all together in person, we would be clapping very high, very loudly, and standing ovation. But unfortunately, we're stuck in our offices and we're in Zoom. But hopefully we can pick up this conversation at some other point. On behalf of RCEA, thanks so much, and hope to see you at future conferences.